Hi everyone, welcome to How to Make Climate Change Sexy, hosted by me, Issey Gladston. This week's episode is a live panel recording at the launch of Emma Hakansson's book, Total Ethics Fashion. Emma's an activist passionate about collective liberation, and she's interested in anti-speciesism, and she's the founding director of the not-for-profit Collective Fashion Justice. Collective Fashion Justice is dedicated to the creation of a total ethics fashion system. In this panel, I was also joined by the designer Eirinn Hayhow. She combines notions of science, philosophy and spirituality to reconnect people to the earth. She creates gender-fluid garments that centre well-being, wild foraging and biodesign to create unique garments. We're also joined by Daze Aghaji. Daze is an environmental regeneration activist whose work focuses on regenerative cultures, intersectionality, radical social justice and youth political engagement. In this panel, we'll discuss what total ethics fashion is and how we can move towards this kind of system. I hope you enjoy the discussion. Hi, I'm Issey. I'm a photographer, writer and podcaster, and I host How to Make Climate Change Sexy. It is a sustainable fashion podcast with quite a snarky angle to the Instagram page, but it's also a lot of fun. I think I really felt like there was a space to be silly and try and get some Gen Z on board with us. I'm joined today by Daze and Eirinn. I thought I'd let you both introduce yourselves.
Sure. Hi, I'm Eirinn. I'm a sustainable fashion designer and I essentially make biocouture garments from foraging different plants and then making it into biomaterial or plant leathers in my collections.
I think you're being very modest. You're also a British Fashion Council designer. You just displayed your collection in London Fashion Week. Everyone talks about her as a really big deal. So I just want to put that out there.
Thank you.
And that's what you call sisterhood. I'm Daze. I'm an environmental justice activist, artist, and forager too. My foraging takes part in herbalism. My focus in my work has been around this thing called regenerative cultures, and it's about how do we take what we learn as self-care into the community care, and then finally earth care, and how does this extend beyond just ourselves to the animals and then even to the non-human or more than human life as well. And yeah, it's led me to be involved in politics. I ran for Parliament, being the youngest person to do so for the European parliamentary elections. And then I also sued my government twice because, as you can tell, they're not very good.
Okay, so this evening we're going to discuss what does a total fashion ethics look like? Like what does it look like in practice? What are the solutions that we can employ? And what does everyone's perspective bring to this discussion? So in all good writing, I guess we need to define our terms. So Emma, can you run us through what a total ethics fashion system means?
Yes. So, like I talked to a little bit now, total ethics fashion is about prioritising people, our fellow animals, and the planet before profit. When we want to simplify that, we can acknowledge that people are animals, as I said before, and that all of that sentient life is just a part of nature. So really, it's just a fashion industry that values nature and life before profit. I wanted to come up with a new term because we already had sustainable fashion, ethical fashion, fair, slow, cruelty-free, vegan, every other term. They had been used to the point of meaninglessness, I think sometimes. They'd become greenwashing terms, marketing terms, and I wanted something that couldn't kind of have issues slip through. We see sometimes that something will be labelled ethical because there's fair labour behind it, and that's so important, but it might be fair labour producing something made from suffering of an animal. We also might see something that's labelled as vegan, but it's made from a fossil fuel-derived material, which also isn't a part of the future of fashion. So total ethics is about really being collective and being dedicated to what we want in the future and to prioritising autonomy and respect for life ahead of exploitation and destruction.
Mm-hmm. And Daze, you kind of mentioned that you are, or in some of your writing, you say that you're an environmental regenerative activist, and you avoid the terms of climate activist. And I was wondering to you, what is the difference between being an environmental regenerative activist versus a climate activist, and how does the cooptation of sustainability terms, particularly in the fashion industry, make your job harder when you're trying to communicate with people?
So that was a big one. The reason I use environmental regeneration is because climate is too narrow. And I'm going to explain this, so give me a second. But people forget that we actually have 9 planetary boundaries to Earth. So there are 9 boundaries we have to be aware of as we continue to be here as people. Climate is merely one. So when we focus so solely on climate, we forget about the all other 8, which can also push us into issues. One that many people know about is biodiversity. That sits separate to climate, so is ozone layer and a bunch of many more. So when I talk about environmental regeneration, it's this recognition that we have to see everything holistically. We have to see everything as interacting with one another and fully understanding what it means to live in ecosystems. But then also there's one that we have to recognize that we ourselves are part of these ecosystems. And therefore we have to kind of bring this regenerative mindset, not just about taking and not just about taking and giving enough that you're taking, but something even more so than that. Like this like real essence of how do we give more than what we are like taking from in the earth. And that's the only way we can actually lead to regeneration.
Mm-hmm. And Eirinn, I kind of saw on your website that you actually don't use any sustainability buzzwords. I really loved it, the way that you just talk about like the connection to nature and plants and animals. Was that a conscious choice, like to avoid these confusing words that have been co-opted by greenwashing, or did it just happen naturally?
I think it happened naturally, but for reasons, certain reasons, like Emma has mentioned, about how I feel like in the industry these words are sort of just thrown around and taken for granted without actually people really knowing what context they're to. Like I know, for example, that there's loads of sort of brands or beauty products that say that that you can plant a tree if you buy from them. So like everyone instantly thinks that's really beautiful, I'm going to plant a tree. But then when you look into into forests in general, there are certain parts of the forest that need trees planted in specific regions. So people are now planting trees carelessly without putting them in their right environments, without knowing the implications of the surrounding wildlife around them. Mm-hmm. So that is one reason why I wouldn't necessarily use these kind of words. Also, from an understanding and reaching out to more people, I think about everything again in like a holistic level and try and use words where people can understand it in a sort of intuitive and emotional way where they can reconnect to nature through their spirit, I guess.
And to bring animals into the question, Belle mentioned or spoke a lot about kind of animals in the fashion industry and how I think before you start learning about sustainable fashion, I mean, I definitely had this opinion that animal products were like a byproduct, and that's how they got into the industry, rather than being, as they actually are, which is a co-product. Emma, in your book you mention the mental health effects of people who work in slaughterhouses and people who work in these very like violent and difficult environments, and it made me think about how at its core when we decide what we're wearing, we're really just thinking about self-representation, like what do I, or at least I do when I get dressed, like what do I want to say to a room full of people, what am I showing them about me, how do I feel about my outfit? And it's so interesting that we don't carry that ethical dimension into what we're wearing. We don't think, actually, by wearing this, I'm showing that maybe I don't care as much about certain things. So I was going to ask you, can there ever be a sustainable or ethical fashion system without considering animal rights?
So first, I want to give a bit of context on the mental health implications that you talked about. If you're someone who works in a slaughterhouse, and I think we often forget slaughterhouses are a part of fashion supply chains, you're much more likely to experience something called perpetration-induced traumatic stress, which is basically the same as PTSD. It has all the same symptoms, but it comes as a result of causing trauma to someone else rather than trauma coming to you and that being the only problem. It's not really surprising when you think about it. No one wants to work in a slaughterhouse. It's no one's dream job. And I think that connects into what you're talking about. If we become more aware of everything that comes into our clothes, we're more able to decide if they represent our values. And you're right, our clothes represent our kind of aesthetic tastes, but they can also represent what we want to see in the world. And when it comes to animals, I think my view on ethics in fashion is we start with a kind of foundational value system. If our foundational value system is that we oppose oppression and discrimination, that has to be a consistent value. And if we decide that life is a priority over profit, that has to be a consistent value as well. And so it means refusing the commodification of anyone, and so that also includes other animals.
And I think something I love in your designs, Eirinn, is how you show how we can kind of understand the effect that our clothing has on us in a positive way, and how you bring that into your design system, like having clothing that has certain plants integrated into it to have certain mental health effects. And I was wondering what inspired you to bring those two worlds together.
So for me, I've always been interested in using sort of unwanted or disregarded things in my work. I came from a fine art background, and that's translated from that through to fashion. But as I did more research into the effect of certain fibres and their chemical compounds and how they have effect on our body, for example, EDC is a chemical found in plastic, and it mimics the female hormone estrogen. In certain rivers where there's been wildlife that have been hugely contaminated with this chemical, they no longer have male or female genders and can't reproduce. So then that obviously opposes the question, is our plastic consumption provoking man-made evolution? So then when I started to think about this, I was thinking about, I stopped using all waste materials in my clothes and focused on only using things that I could either make myself, that I could forage, or that I could source sustainably. And about 7 years ago, I sort of went on a journey through sobriety where I got really interested in herbalism and looking at what kind of plants can help us with things like depression or anxiety or other neurological disorders. So it's been a kind of journey for me, but through my clothes, thinking about the wearer and what they can wear as our skin being like a living, breathing thing. So I now basically include specific plants and barks with healing properties and infuse them into my clothes. I forage things seasonally to make natural dyes. I then use the wastewater and the waste plant matter and then kind of grow that into biomaterial, which is sort of like a plastic alternative, and then also like a plant leather that can be an alternative to suede or other leathers. And then the difference between my material and the kind of materials that you can buy, potentially like Pinatex and Miso Works, that do offer a plant-based alternative. They still use things like plastics as coatings to make it last a long time and obviously be more commercial. So the difference between that and my materials is that they are fully biodegradable. I wouldn't say that they're commercial, but then you say something really interesting in your book about how fashion has moved from being an art form to becoming something that's just there to support our capitalist system. And I think that if we start to also look at fashion as art again, then as designers there could be a really interesting future for the fashion industry, as well as it being more sustainable.
And you mentioned there the kind of contradictions that exist, like using a bio-based material but then coating it in plastic.
Yeah.
And it makes me think of a really good graphic in the book. I'm not sure what page it is, but there's like 3 overlapping circles, and it shows you kind of, I feel like Emma's going to be a magical assistant. It's really cool because it demonstrates these blind spots that we have in something that's like bio-based, or a material like, remember when H&M did a vegan collection, but it was all made out of plastic. So this diagram is incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
So we've discussed like the impact on humans, the impact on other animals in the supply chain. Daze, as a Gen Z, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on like how Gen Z is demanding a change in the fashion system, or do you think there's also a complacency in this age group?
I think, we're in this really interesting time of where young people are actually really fucking tired of basically being sold lies. And as someone who's not a fashion expert, but merely a consumer, it's really interesting to come into fashion I've always loved fashion. Actually, at one point, I wanted to be a fashion designer. And I grew up in this world of expecting everything to be as it was, and then finding out it wasn't, and finding out that there was a climate crisis, as biodiversity crisis, and many crises attacking this generation. And what we're starting to see is that a lot of young people are following through with what they consider as their values. I work in philanthropic organisations, and we actually put a research paper out that talked about young people and their values. Young people are more likely to be unemployed and choose unemployment than follow through against their own value systems. And this is making everyone have to change. This is making industry has to change, or they just don't get the best talent. This is making companies have to change because people won't be buying their goods. And I'm a big believer of really acknowledging the idea of what does it mean to die in culture and embracing death. And I think embracing the death of a culture that doesn't care is the next step, and I think Gen Z is pushing that through. You know, we've seen like the rise in thrifting, cool things around how can we kind of bring nature solutions into the way that we think about fashion, whether it's like mushroom leathers or even going further, like, you know, using things like nettle to borage and all of these really cool things that are kind of old school knowledge but can be brought into a way that feels really sexy and cool, and I see that just being a trend that's going to go forward.
Yeah, I think the question of fashion as a vehicle for change is so inspiring, and fashion kind of returning to its artistic and creative roots and the like potential that lies in there. There's actually a quote from the book that I'd also like to read. I feel like everyone's really reading a lot of it, but it says, "The fashion industry does not only design clothes, it designs supply chains, and in turn it designs environments. When we buy clothes, we curate not only our wardrobes and our outfits, but we curate landscapes and biomes. We decide if the planet will be stripped bare of biodiversity, of life, of well-being, or we will allow it to be cloaked in a rich abundance of floral and fauna life." And I loved how this showed that we're at a crossroads right now. Like, it can either be this force for good, as you've both spoken about, or it can be this force of destruction. And actually we get to decide how we move forward. So we've touched briefly on questions of supply chain with Eirinn, and I wanted to explore the ways in which we can redesign the current fashion system to align better with the total ethics fashion system. So Eirinn, you kind of mentioned this, that your supply chain isn't a web. It's not even a vertical supply chain like a lot of industry is trying to move towards for traceability. Yours is this like single link where you just kind of spin and exist in it. You produce your own materials, and you were the first designer to create something couture out of your own materials that you made by hand. I was wondering what inspired you to start innovative material production.
I think it takes back to when I was doing my dissertation and looking at the chemicals in plastic, and then it kind of really blew my mind. I mean, I was aware that there were issues with it, but I wasn't aware of the severity of it. And that, combined with seeing how much I was able to grow myself through exploring using certain plants for my own mental health and well-being, it made me think about like everything, like what we consume, what we do, what we drink, what we eat, the products we put on our skin. And obviously there have been many changes and awareness is brought in those areas, I think, particularly again in Gen Z and some millennials. But I think that fashion and garments is something that's not really, it's not really been considered in that sense. Like, people don't think about putting a garment on and how that's gonna, if you put a certain plastic garment on, is that actually gonna make me more anxious? People aren't thinking about that. But then obviously the mental health statistics have got worse and worse over the years. And then I wonder, is this potentially, could this also be connected with the clothes? Yeah.
And do you have a favourite material that you've like got to grips with?
I think in terms of people looking at it and probably it looking the most like a material, like I made a coffee leather. I have a friend that actually lives in the same building as me, and she has her own coffee roasting business. So she gives all her coffee grounds to me, and then I turn them into coffee leather. And as a material, I feel like it has quite a good longevity, and it looks like leather or suede. It also smells amazing. So in terms of a consumable material, I think that was the best. But for my latest collection, I find them much more exciting because I've used sort of lavender, chamomile, valerian, loads of different barks, and done research into sort of ancient myth associated with those specific barks, and then I've infused them in the collections. They don't look as commercial, but I think that they're much more interesting, and when you wear them, you can feel and smell the scents that are within the garments. And the puffer jackets are also stuffed with dried hay, so you also literally feel like you're living on a farm, which is quite relaxing.
That's amazing. So that's kind of like integrated, like your business is you, and you're the one that makes the decision. Daze, I know that you do quite a bit of consulting in the like commercial sector, and I was wondering how you deal with the siloization of sustainability into singular departments. Is there anything that you do to try and get people who are working across the business to start making decisions based around sustainability and ethics?
Yeah, so activist turned consultant pipeline is a thing. And it first started with this recognition that as an activist, and my background is in grassroots, so I was in Extinction Rebellion, gluing myself to the floor, planning rebellions. And then I realized it's like, what happens when they actually do want to change and they don't know what they're doing? And that's where it kind of gets a bit contentious with activists, because some people go, they are the problem. And some people go, they need a hand. And some people go, I've just graduated with, a degree in finance and I can use this to build my career. And usually those people turn into consultants. So that's when I decided I will become a consultant. And I get to work with a whole plethora of companies in many different ways. But my consultancy practice is slightly different because it's not really about they come to me with they want a climate risk strategy, and I go yes, and the bit that I talk about at the end is how do I get them to recognize that this isn't them putting something on nature, this is them building a relationship with nature so they can learn how to care. And then through that, the work will naturally evolve. So that kind of took me into this weird way of where I built my own consultancy that's based on nature connection. And the first step is that you are going to learn to love nature, or we don't move on to the next step. And it does work, surprisingly. I've done Fortune 500 companies and been met with so much resistance at first. And then next thing you know, they're sending me meditation clips. So there is this moment of where people do buy onto it and start to learn how to care. I think a good example of this could be with Bupa. Last year I worked with a health insurer, and I remember taking on this client thinking, private healthcare, not really my thing. But I could feel this real eagerness from the company to really recognize environment and sustainability, but far broader than that. So I worked with the heads of all the Bupa groups internationally to get them to learn how to love nature, spending a weekend with them in the countryside and talking about their childhood stories, watching them forage together, watching them love nature together and become like children. And then on to another project where I helped seed activists throughout their departments, because I feel that, we always forget that these companies aren't just big evil companies doing lots of evil. They are also made of people, and there are people who care deep in there. There are people who are waiting for permission to make changes. So I got to train a whole heap of different activists and seed them through the organization. So when I left, they were the ones to cause the trouble when they see people doing things that stand against humans and stand against nature. And I think that's how we do it. We encourage the rebellion within all of us and then seed it out into the world.
Yeah, so it's more about shifting mindset and kind of giving them permission to do something. Another thing, kind of thinking about shifting mindset, design is so central to the fashion industry, and design is also something that can help us move forward. There's another quote from the book that says, "Since when was good, interesting, beautiful, clever fashion about following the status quo or about being unthinking?" And I liked the word unthinking to kind of really root in an ethical approach. So there's like, within this question of design, there's an invitation to move beyond a constant trend cycle and actually create something positive. We've already touched on bio-based, but another way in which design is helping is circular design and moving towards a more circular industry. But this is something that I think we're also struggling with in a technical approach and also a cultural approach. So Emma, what do you think are the key things that are stopping us moving towards a more circular fashion system?
I think one of the big things is where we see value in fashion, which there's been a lot of discussion about that. If we see value in fashion only in the monetary sense, then we're not going to be so willing to invest in the other kinds of values, in the value of nature and the value that circularity has for that natural system. So I think that's one big part of it. And I think also a lot of it is fear. So much of fashion is built on creativity and is built on innovation. And clearly we're good at that. Like, we produce beautiful things all of the time. But I think if we had more trust and willingness in our capacity for creativity and innovation, we'd put more of it into supporting that natural system and totally redesigning not only a garment itself, but the supply chain behind it and its whole life cycle. So what is going to happen to it before it is actually made into a thing you can wear, and what's going to happen to it when someone doesn't care to wear it anymore. I think a lot of designers hope if they can just produce something beautiful enough, it will be worn forever. It's just never going to happen. Like, people will die, people will hand things on to someone else that doesn't want it anymore. Eventually things have to go back to nature without harm, or they have to be able to be made into something else. And I think that we need to become more comfortable with our capacity to deal with it, because we totally can. We just need to decide to.
And a circular versus a linear system really represents a big challenge for business models, because you can't rely on this constant growth and consumption in your consumer. You have to really shift how you're doing things. I know that it's something that a lot of, as you mentioned, Daze, a lot of like Gen Z and people, I guess, from all generations are really having a shift at the moment and realizing that we need things to change. What do you think are the benefits for the businesses if they decide to make these changes, these brands that decide to take an alternative approach?
So there was a government policy paper that was written 2 years ago, and it was literally titled "Adapt or Die," and that's what I think is going to happen to businesses. You have to adapt to where people are going with this real recognition of our place in the ecosystem and our place to do good. And if you don't do that, I think we have to start embracing the cultural grieving of big fashion houses that aren't going to come with us in the journey. And that has to become okay, which is very difficult to kind of tackle in a society that totally fears death. Because some things aren't meant to stay forever. Some things are meant to die and compost to make fertile ground to grow new, and lots of shake, so we all agree on that. So yeah, I think it's one of those, at the moment, is actually becoming less a situation of having to convince companies to move, more of them feeling the urgency of either throwing in the towel and trying to stay status quo till status quo changes, and then they have no option but to let go.
And Eirinn, you kind of, as a designer, what excites you about taking a new approach and a new road to things?
I think, I think that, in terms of education, unfortunately, in some ways, and what you're taught in universities, like I remember when I was actually doing my MA, I was trying to tell my teacher that I would go to charity shops and get my garments, and that I was investigating biomaterial and I wanted to do natural dyes. And I remember him being like, how are you going to put cost to that? Or like, how are you going to take that to a factory, and all these kind of methods. And I think that there's still maybe an issue in education where people aren't catching up with the innovation and the opportunities that potentially biomaterials and other natural fibres that can be used in material production. I think this needs to come through education, so that then young designers that are going to university and going through education know that it's a possibility for them to think about these things.
And on that question of education, Emma, I know that you've been into universities. How do you find that process? Is it often quite a challenge, or do you find your students are like very receptive to this new thing?
I find it so much easier and so much more hopeful to speak to students that are my age or younger than me than whenever I speak to the industry and to, I am an adult, but to adults. I feel like, those people are desperate to talk about this kind of thing, even if they haven't necessarily had a name to it. Often I find it interesting where lecturers, because I'm just like the guest lecturer or the person that's come in, the lecturer is asking lots of questions that I think their students already know the answer to, and I find that really interesting. But also I'm really interested in, like you're saying, changing education. So we're trying to move beyond not just doing guest lectures, but actually changing the entire course, changing the units in how fashion is taught, so that we can teach designing supply chains and designing systems, not just designing individual garments. And that is starting to really pick up now. So that's something that's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. And I think that speaks to what Daze mentioned earlier about giving people permission. I feel like a lot of this work is people are inherently good and inherently care, but you just have to give them space to show that they care and that they want to be involved and that it's something that they can start thinking about. So on that question, I think I was going to ask each of you about what the sector that you tend to work with can do to move towards a total ethics fashion system. So maybe, Eirinn, how can designers move towards a total ethics fashion system?
I think that they need to start looking into kind of ancient methods of how you make materials, slowing down, looking at vegan options in terms of material, looking at what they can forage. I think these kind of educations should be implicated into the universities, as well as obviously natural dye workshops and things like that. And I think just people knowing that there is like a whole world out there that you can explore locally, or go to specific sites to search for different plants and barks and things you can forage, and as well as growing your own. I think that should be something that should be implicated into the arts and fashion education.
Yeah, and I think also just kind of giving the everyday person the power to have control over their own production, like reclaiming lost skills and lost crafts, like knitting and repair and all of these things that we just seem to have like slipped through our fingers in the last few generations. Dazed, from your work with people in power and suing the government, how would you convince these types of people to move towards a more total ethics fashion system?
I really love what Eirinn said about the ancient knowledge systems. There's a phrase called the World Wide Woods, and it's this whole idea that we can learn from the ways that woods interact with each other to learn about ecosystems, how we play a part. But then also there's a part that like humans are like really awesome at creating things, and like we created things like the internet, for example. And it's like, how do we combine this new age knowledge that allows us to keep innovating with the things of the past that we shouldn't have actually left behind? I'm a big William Morris lover, so much. And those kind of ideas around how do we have things that have purpose but have beauty? How do we start to make things with our hands? And as activists, a lot of time we spend, plotting and scheming. But then also, I remember at my first year in Extinction Rebellion, we had to actually do some work at the Art Factory. And at the Art Factory, still to this day, the flags are printed by block prints. And you sit there and you carve and you do things with your hands. And you connect deeper with something else far greater than ourselves. And it's like leveling you into having the space to think with your minds, but then also having the space and time to do things with your body and feel embodied in your actions. And I think that's the next step of doing things. A lot of work, especially in politics, is very heady. But where's the space for heart? Where's the space for somatic healing and loving? And I think that's just the next steps. And we're seeing that in a lot of different candidates, especially in the States. Marianne Williamson, if anyone knows, but she's amazing. And she talks about how do we bring love, radical love, into politics. And that's the way that's going to go forward. And if politics change, policy changes, and it affects all industries.
Emma, I was wondering, for you, like what's the one thing that you would say to consumers and to, I guess, everyone leaving this room tonight, like how should they carry this message forward?
I think the first thing I would say is that we should do a relabeling and think of ourselves first as citizens before we think of ourselves as consumers. There's a report from the Hot and Cool Institute that says that within these planetary boundaries that we have, we should really only be buying 5 newly made garments a year. So that means we only have 5 opportunities to be a consumer in fashion, but we have every day as an opportunity to be a citizen. And I think that is where we can, as individuals, come together and impact policy and impact the industry. And that's where I think it's most exciting. Of course, we need to vote with our dollar. Of course, we need to change how we consume. It's hugely critical. But there's only so many opportunities to do that before we're perpetuating overproduction. Whereas if we ask questions of ourselves, of the industry, of government, then we can change the system in a more radical way. And I think that's really important. I also will note that at the end of the book, there is a whole little section on, like, what do I do now? So more answers there.
Mm-hmm. And I think only being able to make 5 decisions a year really changes the entire thing.
You have to love it if you want to buy it, if there's only that many. Thank you, everyone, for listening to us all. Thank you. Thank all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in this week. I'd like to thank Emma and Collective Fashion Justice for inviting me to moderate the panel, Reference Point for hosting us, and Grace for recording the sound. See you next episode. Bye!